Hi, all. Thank you so much for joining us today, both the panelists as well as the attendees. My name is Abby Haber. I handle marketing here at Sten & Press. We're a small indie publisher based out of New York City that specializes in bilingual, illustrated poetry, and other genre-bending writing. First and foremost, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the breadth and geographic diversity of people in attendance here today. We have people from Palo Alto to Cairo. Fostering international community is so important to our mission and our spirit here at the Press, so we're grateful to each and every one of you that are with us today. Two brief logistical notes. The panel discussion is going to be recorded, and you'll be able to find it on our website afterwards for future viewing. There will also be a portion of this discussion today in which you'll be able to ask questions to our panelists. To be able to do so, you should find a question mark button. You should see it on your screen as an attendee. So if the question is more technical in nature, our organizer will address it, but obviously if it's directed to the panelists, we'll bring it up later in the discussion. We have such an amazing lineup today. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Yasser Sultan, who joins us today from Georgetown University's doctoral program in history. He researches masculinity, nationalism, and gender in modern Egypt. And we're so appreciative of you sharing your time, attention, and expertise with us today.
Thanks, Abby. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, depending on where you are. It's a real pleasure for me to moderate this event. As Abby mentioned, my name is Yasser Sultan. I'm a doctoral candidate in Middle East and North African history at Georgetown. And I want to welcome you to our virtual roundtable on letters from Cairo, which is an exciting new publication by Sten & Press. The book is an unconventional memoir which relates the experiences of two young American academics, Franz Dolp and Ruperta Dolp, who spent 2.5 years as researchers in Cairo in the mid-1960s. The book includes over 100 letters and 75 historical photographs of Cairo and Aswan, in addition to a multilingual transcription and English translation of its accompanying archival recording, Sounds of Cairo, which captured calls of Cairo's street vendors, political rallies, the vocals of Kulthum, and other aspects of Cairo's soundscape. The 1960s in Egypt was a period of several pivotal historical moments. The end of the union with Syria, the construction of the High Dam in Aswan, Egypt's involvement in the war in Yemen, Arab socialism, Pan-Arabism, and most importantly, the 1967 war with Israel, all of which taking place within the global context of the Cold War. Ruperta's and France's sojourn in Cairo coincided with this time of great political and social turmoil. And their account is not one that is primarily concerned with politics, but it captures some aspects of everyday life in Cairo during these pivotal years. There is a lot to get to, so what I would like to do now is just briefly introduce our distinguished panelists for our roundtable. And I apologize that we are not actually sitting around the table, let alone around one. Titles can be a little misleading in this post-COVID world, but we do have 3 distinguished historians of modern Egypt and the editor of the volume herself, Dr. Laura Dolp, who is going to be our first speaker. Dr. Dolp is a practitioner, writer, and researcher about music as a site of human transformation. Her work often includes themes of music and spirituality, the interrelation of music and social spaces, and the poetics of the natural world. Our second speaker is Jewel Beinin, who is the Donald J. McLachlan Professor of History and Professor of Middle East History, Emeritus at Stanford University. Dr. Beinin is a very towering figure in the field of modern Middle East history, in particular the study of labor movements, and political economy of modern Egypt, Palestine, and Israel. Our third speaker is Dr. Annelies de Vries, who is an assistant professor of world history at Samford University in Birmingham, Alabama. Her scholarship explores the impact of global influences on modern Egyptian history, with particular attention to spatial analysis, economic networks, and women's and gender history. Our fourth speaker is Dr. Alia Musallam, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the EUME Forum Transregionale Studien in Berlin, where she is writing a book on the visual and musical archiving practices of the builders of the Aswan High Dam and the Nubian communities displaced by it. I would like to hand it over directly to the speakers, who will each speak for about 7 minutes. And then after these initial interventions, we'll have about 10 minutes for our discussion as a panel. And finally, we will pivot into the Q&A. So if any of our wonderful audiences has a question, please type it in the questions box. Now let me pivot over to the speakers. Laura will preface our discussion today. So why don't you take the virtual floor?
Thank you, Yasser. So I would first like to just give a shout out to the Sten Press staff, Abby Haber and Danielle Sinclair, for the considerable work that it took to put this panel together. Very appreciative of that. And I'd also like to say how grateful I am to my mother, Bobby Dalp, for so generously allowing me to publish these letters during her lifetime, and to think out loud in a public forum about their meanings. I'd like to just help set the stage in these brief minutes to describe my own process and the goals for the book, and some of the larger themes and the questions that I've also kind of encountered along the way, particularly as its role as an archive. So I'd like to begin with a sentence that really acts as the epigraph for the Letters for Cairo. It's a thought from Italo Calvino's book Invisible Cities, which he expresses the idea that the more that we become lost in the unfamiliar quarters of distant cities, the more we understand the other cities that we've crossed to arrive there. And like I said, it serves as an epigraph for this collection because for me it so beautifully describes its contents. And also it encapsulates the sort of transformative labor of its authors. Its communication as a collection, as a book, spans 3 generations of my family, from my grandparents who received the letters, to my mother who authored them, and to my own role as an archivist and commentator. So the materials for this literally landed in my lap. My mother unexpectedly gave these 2 large bundles of letters. There were about 145 letters written between 1964 and 1966. There were hundreds of photographs, and there was 3 hours of audio tape on a reel-to-reel tape. So I listened and read it first without sort of expectation, but only this increasing curiosity for the story that it traced, which was the departure of my parents, Robert, Roberta, and Franz, from Berkeley, California, to Cairo. Their domestic, the accounts of their domestic and their professional lives for about 2.5 years, as well as 2 summer trips to the Middle East and across North Africa. There was also, as I've said, and Yasser mentioned, the transcription and translation of the audio. And the archival recording was particularly interesting to me. You know, as the months went by, I began to realize that it really needed considerable, careful, and sustained attention in order to kind of make it accessible for this would-be book's potential audience. And as a result, this volume contains an extensive transcription and translation of a wide variety of sound, from music to political rallies to Quran recitation off the radio to environmental sounds recorded out the window of their Garden City apartment. And if anyone is interested, after this, you're welcome to stream that from the Sten & Press website. So the impetus for them moving to Cairo was a research fellowship offered by the Social Research Center at the American University in Cairo to my father, Franz, who was a labor economist, to study the impact of the high dam construction on the town of Aswan. But within months of their arrival, it became very clear that the political circumstances were not going to allow him to do this, and the Aswan officials basically shut down and refused him access in particular ways that didn't allow him to do the research. And so he was forced quite quickly, really, to refocus his labor research on other industries, and eventually settling on a steel plant in Helwan. And one of the, it's true that the reason that they went was because of my father's research, but it's reading the letters, it very quickly obviously becomes apparent that that Roberta is really the architect of this story, of this account. And so for me, as a historian with an interest in, or a kind of a specialty in other disciplines, even just as a historian in general, it was very interesting to me that all of a sudden I was thrown into this issue of whose story is being recounted, who's telling the story. And this is an ongoing theme in the letters themselves, as she toggles in her tone between them. She wrote consistently once a week to both her parents in Rochester, New York, and also sent letters to his parents in Seattle, Washington. So the narrative exists only in one direction. In other words, we don't have any of the letters that their parents wrote back to them. So it's one-sided in the sense that, to make sense of the conversation in terms of one can implicitly and deduce what is being said by the way that she responds or the kinds of questions that she responds to, but we don't have those responses physically. And one of the ongoing themes then of this collection is, how do we adapt to our audiences in this form? And I consider this book in some ways to be a kind of living demonstration of the ways that conversations define families, the ways that they define roles of particular members of families. As one might expect, she is, with her parents, she is more frank in certain ways. She more readily shares her frustrations and her successes in her own professional opportunities as a researcher in biochemistry at the Naval Medical Research Unit, otherwise known as NAMRO 3, and also as a chemistry instructor at AUC. It also gave me a renewed appreciation for the value of quotidian details. So these observations that we make about our everyday lives that in retrospect tell very rich stories, kind of reinstilled that sense in me of the value of concrete objects, not only as kind of the markers of commerce, for example, but also of culture and also memory and the familiarity of home, that concrete familiarity of home. To the left, for example, is a drawn image of their new apartment in Cairo and the way that she was navigating space. And to the right is a list of the things that they missed and wanted their parents to bring from the US. The last one, for example, is a request to her mother, Josephine, to collect the silver linings from Josephine's cigarette wrappers, to bring them in whole, because she thought that they would make beautiful ornaments for the Christmas tree. So one of the major questions was how to present this archive. And it was very important to me to work through the issue of who is this for, and also how to retain the concrete feeling of reading these letters. When I first opened them, I was the first person in 50 years to read these letters. And you know, the power of that and the kind of visceral material nature of that. So I decided to reproduce them as facsimiles. In other words, there are not transcriptions of these letters. You have to actually read the letters in their original to make sense of them. And so in a sense, you could say that the material goal for the collection was to get out of its way and to minimize, in a way, my own intervention, to present them as historical objects, provided that they were legible enough. And I was able to do that, fortunately, because my mom has very, very clear handwriting, and also that they were well preserved. Another aspect of this collection that was, you know, that I began to investigate was how and why do we collect? How and why do we engage in lost worlds, for example? And to whom do those lost worlds belong? Those kinds of larger questions come up again and again in her recounting and fascination with the ancient world, but also the ways that the contemporary world intersected with that. And there was both wonder and also discomfort of their stories of going to explore archaeological sites, to collect a shard of antique pottery or preserve this, for example, as well as on the right-hand side, the narrative and visual evidence of the Fustat excavation, of these large excavations in and around Cairo during this period. Another thing that came up was, you know, how are we shaped by language and media? In other words, how were they interpreting the experience that they were having? And there was considerable tension for me as someone who was coming at this later about their lived experience and their analysis, which had been formulated through English language, understandably English language periodicals and books, and then also in reverse to educate their own parents. It's very obvious that in these letters that they expect them in ways to not understand and to feel very far away from the experience of or even alienated from the experience that they were having. So again and again and again, they were attempted to explain their experience in that sense. So, you know, standing back from the collection as a whole, for me, it really reveals their obvious awe for the history of the region and its cultural riches and its political complexities and the visceral physical experience. For example, one letter states that one can stand on a hill near the citadel overlooking this great city and hear the din of literally millions of human voices. So I won't take any more time. I will pass the microphone along, but I just wanted to say on a personal note how this book has shaped my own thinking, that I owed a great deal, and in its capacity to create sort of both discomfort and insight, and how it in particular has encouraged me to think in sustained way about ghosts and about the ways that we carry and perform memory. So I look very much to hearing the other panelists and joining in the conversation afterwards. Yasser, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Laura, for that amazing opening remark. And now let's move on to Dr. Beinin. Dr. Beinin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yasser. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, everyone. Thank you to Danielle Sinclair and Abby Haber of Sten and Press for inviting me to take part in this roundtable. When I was asked to do this at first, I thought, wow, this is just like my life, sort of, but not really. Because I first went to Cairo to study Arabic at the American University in Cairo in the summer of 1969. So many of the things that the Dalps describe are very familiar to me, all of the day-to-day difficulties of navigating Cairo, the difficulties of gaining access to research materials. A lot of those things were the same in 1969 as they were a few years earlier. And some of those things are more or less the same, even if perhaps even more intense now. There was, however, a very big difference, which is that the Dalps were in Cairo between 1964 and 1966. And half a year after they left, the June 1967 war erupted. And pretty much everything in Egypt, at the political level at least, changed as a consequence. There was also a difference in our personal circumstances. They came to Egypt accidentally. Someone offered Professor Dalp a job as a researcher. I came to Egypt after studying Arabic and Middle East studies for 3 years at Princeton University, and then my advisor said, "Oh, you should go to the American University in Cairo's intensive summer Arabic course and improve your Arabic." And I thought that was an excellent idea. And I was very excited to go, be able to go and speak Arabic to people, except that I actually couldn't because I was studying modern standard Arabic and it was totally useless for communicating with people. I mean, I arrived there and literally I didn't know how to order a cup of coffee. One of my colleagues, whose modern standard Arabic was at a very high level, better than mine at the time, got up very early in the morning, the first day that we arrived there, because of course we all had jet lag, and the police picked him up and he started speaking standard Arabic. And the policeman had no idea what he's saying and took him to the police station to talk to some higher officer who had enough education to understand what this weird person, an American, not just a foreigner, but an American. The United States had no diplomatic relations with Egypt after the '67 war was saying. And eventually it was understandable and nothing bad happened. But that incident captured for me the perils of being in Cairo. It didn't happen to me, it happened to a friend of mine at that moment. It was actually quite frightening for a foreigner, a young American, to be in Egypt for the first time, even though I thought I knew something about where I was. After all, I've been studying the Middle East for 3 years. I had read all those books that Laura had just put on the screen that the Dalps had read. I mean, none of them are actually all that good. There's much better literature now, but that's what there was. But it was totally inadequate to grasp what was going on socially in Egypt. Here was an entire population whose understanding of what Egypt was and what Egypt's status in the world was completely upended by the war. Many of the things that President Nasser had been promising could no longer be accomplished. Maybe they couldn't have ever been accomplished, but certainly not after the war. There were walls in front of many of the buildings, brick walls in front of many of the buildings in downtown Cairo, because there was a war of attrition between Israel and Egypt, mostly over the Suez Canal, but Israeli planes sometimes did deep bombing in Egypt, so the population was terrified. We knew nothing about that. No one told us, "Oh, you're going to Egypt and they're having a war there, by the way." No, we did not know. The war of attrition ended by the end of the summer that we were there. So there was all of this tension around us. And we were often followed by secret police. They were especially suspicious of the fact that we're Americans who, after a month or so, we could speak some Egyptian Arabic. And so if we were to get into a conversation with someone on the street, that was already a matter of suspicion. The university bought memberships in the Gezira Club, the same sporting club that the Dalps mentioned in the book, for us for the summer. And we'd go over there on the bus. I mean, nobody would go there from the American University in Cairo by bus today because the buses are way too crowded. But they were much, much less so then. And people would ask us who we are, and we'd say we're Americans, and they would say, no, you can't be Americans. Americans don't speak Arabic, which was by and large the case, as was the case with the Dolps. But we were actually Americans, more or less beginning to speak Arabic. So many of the things that the Dolps experienced were part of my own experience on that trip. The next time that I lived in Cairo for a very extended period between 1979 and 1981, I actually lived in Garden City, which is where the Dolps lived. So there's another point of connection between their experience and my own. So I was very comfortable with the book, and I very much appreciated, Laura, that you took that enormous time and effort to put it together. And I especially appreciated that you present it as the archive that it is, because I'm a historian and I like to muck around in dusty old archives. And it stimulated my wife to go back and collect all the letters that I had written to her in the summer of 1969, which I have not yet gone back and reread. So thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Joel, for sharing your experience in Cairo with us. And now let's move on to Dr. DeVries. Floor is yours.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone at Senden Press for putting this together, and Laura for just sharing this collection. So my work has really focused on the history of Mahdi, which is a different sort of planned community further south from Garden City, but it has a really similar history. And my research really looked at a lot of Europeans and their various tracks in and out of Cairo, and concludes right in the early 60s, in 62, when basically a lot of the private European companies that ran these neighborhoods were shut down by the Nasser regime. And the adult story then fits kind of right into that next phase of sort of the life of foreigners in Egypt, especially Americans, because Americans really come to, in the 50s and into the 60s, come to dominate a lot of the economic networks, a lot of the foreign expertise that comes in. Franz's experience in terms of sort of being hired to have a particular role with the dam, and then not being able to fulfill that role. It fits in with a lot of other experiences regarding how foreign expertise was treated, both as a necessity, but then as a potential threat because of the British colonial sort of background. What I really found interesting and appreciated was that how different sort of in a lot of ways I see the American sort of approach to Cairo, that the Dolps stayed for 2.5 years is so different from how a lot of Brits and French, I mean, you had a huge number of foreigners from all over the world who lived in Cairo, especially until the late 40s, because they didn't have to pay taxes. There were just enormous privileges granted to foreigners who lived in Egypt. And so you had long-term foreign domicile in Egypt, and that the Dolps stayed for this shorter amount of time. It really fits with particularly this post-late 40s experience and an American experience. You just have from the 50s forward, Americans kind of in and out of Cairo, but less wed to long-term stay there. And what I found so fascinating about the collection too is just this, as Joel mentioned, this moment right before the 67 war, right before everything turns around, where you can pick up on these continuities with a lot of earlier experiences trying to navigate the markets. I love the audio, so I really encourage those of you who are participating in this to go and listen to it. I love the audio of Roberta discussing sort of the shopping list and all of it, just sort of navigating Cairo, especially because she is, and it is really impressive, but then because so many foreigners don't try to learn Arabic, and she really did invest herself. And I thought that was such a testament to, even if there are things about their experience that were uneven, even if, you know, there's no perfect, you know, way in which to encounter another culture. And it is, you really get a sense of like, this is hard. Like, it was hard for them. And as she navigates that conversation, it's just a real sort of great moment. Those are hard. Those are such a unique kind of archival little treasure there. And it's such a valuable thing that that Laura has sort of shared with researchers. I thought that was a really special sort of moment. And that she's trying to sort of learn the language. She's getting a sort of grocery shop, like, you know, you get that sense of like, what do you have to learn to get by? And a lot of it is like shopping, you know, like navigating marketplaces, hiring, firing household staff, those kinds of things. I just thought that those snippets are really valuable. The collection itself is beautiful. For one, it's just a really lovely, because Roberta's handwriting is so nice and neat and lovely on the page, just to sort of observe the actual aesthetics of the collection, and then to think about that as both an archive and really artistic in so many ways is a really, I think, important contribution to how I think we'll continue rethinking the archive with new media moving forward. It's not, I like that it's packaged for us, but it's not transcribed. And at the same time, it's not just a website. We don't scroll through them, you still leaf through them. I don't know, it's just a really interesting sort of space between the actual physical archive, but not fully in a digital sort of alternate reality of sorts. Overall, it is this moment, sort of this quiet before the storm, which we know that is coming, but they didn't know. And I think that in and of itself is really fascinating. So it was a real pleasure to get to sort of look through and think about like how this does continue. It marks both a profound change, I think, in the experience of a lot of foreigners in Egypt, but it really is evidence of a way that Americans come into the Middle East in different ways. That change with the Suez Canal crisis in '56 is this turning point, and then you get this moment, this 10 years from '56 to '66, that they fit into that, and the archive then is just very illustrative of those changes and how Americans kind of came into that space.
Thank you so much, Annalise. Now let's move on to our last, but definitely not least, speaker, Dr. Alia Musallam. The floor is yours. I think you're on mute.
Thank you for unmuting me. Thank you, Laura, for being very generous and sharing your family's history. Thank you, Abigail and Daniela, for inviting me. It's a really, I mean, I really enjoyed Franz and Roberta's company this last month, reading the letters. They're beautifully written also, and I think I very much experienced I very much experienced Garden City, but also the rest of Egypt, all their travels to Siwa and St. Catherine, and through the oases, etc. Through the eyes of, they weren't just adventurous, but I think because they were seeing them as very new, so they documented every detail in a way that is very beautiful, but also very important. For me, historically, I mean, I think I was invited to look into this mainly because of my work on the High Dam, and my interest in the experience of the High Dam workers on the dam. And my work is totally based on interviews. But I mean, it was a significant experience for me on many levels. I mean, as a historian, I believe that all history, all forms of history, and all archives are memory. So you have the state archives, which is the state's memory, or how the state tries to organize it. People involved in big projects like the High Dam, their memory is the inside of the dam, and then people who encounter the ripple effects of such a big industrial project, or the attempt to liberate a country, or continue the coup using these industrial projects, are also very significant. So the first thing that I did was listen to the tape. And it was really beautiful on several levels. The first is that I'm very homesick to the sounds of Cairo. I live in Berlin at the moment, and I am very conscious of how much I miss the sound of the adhan and how it breaks the day down. I miss Kulthum's voice. She doesn't sing every Thursday anymore, but it's always there in a taxi and in a kiosk, etc. And so to hear, it's so well recorded. I mean, the sound quality is great, but to hear the Rubabikia and Kulthum's voice and the traffic, you hear it coming into an apartment, the way it is actually, the way it forms your sort of soundtrack on a normal day in Cairo. And what was extra significant is when I heard the students in the assembly in the school. So in 1964-65, my father was in 1st and 2nd grade, and he went to school in downtown Cairo. I was super excited to share that with him, and I shared it with both my parents, and we kept sort of going back and forth about, you know, the different things, the sounds of the school, the radio programs, and this was really beautiful. This was a very intimate. It's, you know, it's intimacy sort of ripples intimacy, and yeah, so that was really beautiful. There are various intersections. For me, this was a moment right after 1964, which was also a very a turning point, because there was this question of whether the dam would actually be built or not. And according to the workers and the engineers working on the dam, they didn't think that the diversion of the Nile, which is, I mean, the turbines were finished and the Nile was diverted through the dam in 1964, and they didn't think it would work. And I think a number of the turbines collapsed because the dam was not ready for it. But Nasser really wanted, you know, to meet that deadline, and he wanted it to happen also on the 16th of May, 16th of May, which would coincide with the date of the Nakba in 1948, to sort of reverse that. It was a moment where things were starting to go in a particular direction, which for me explains quite well why France was suddenly cut off, where he couldn't access what was happening on the dam. But he was trying, and his questions were very important and very significant. And I don't think that sort of thing, I mean, how the dam workers were hired, for instance, I'm not sure if that was documented beyond the contracting companies that were hired to do this sort of thing. It's as a historian also, that makes me wonder if there's an archive in the SRC with the research that he did try to do, the proposals that he put together, and I think this will be important to pursue. They were at a crossroads. Also, they were in front of the Algerian embassy, so they were conscious of the Afro-Asian meetings that were happening. The sort of pan-Arab events also. I mean, Roberta's sort of focus on documenting all these details for her parents, I think, were very beautiful. I don't know how conscious she was that she was, you know, that she was in an important historical moment and that she's documenting the details of it. But I think it's really important. It'll continue to be important as a source also, besides the fact that it's so moving and beautiful. And for me personally, for instance, I mean, I know there were a lot of the workers on the dam. There was this constant sort of push for them to be cultured workers as well. I think there was the importance of developing a particular production culture on the dam, and they were very much inspired by the production culture that was developed in Soviet industrial projects. But there was this idea that, you know, if workers are musicians or poets, etc., then there should be more space for them. There's a question of the extent to which that happened, but this idea was always going back and forth. So this artist in the steel plant that that your parents discovered, who created the copper reliefs. His experience is also very important and very much like an important aspect of these industrial projects at the time, and this sort of East and West tension between the support that they were getting from Western Europe for these industrial projects and the support that they were getting from the Soviet Union, and they were playing both sides clearly. Yeah, and finally, I think historically also there's a growing importance being assigned to sounds, and I think Ziad Fahmy works on this a lot, but the importance of sounds for particular moments in time. And because this was such a rich moment culturally, I think they must have seen Firqat Rida, the Rida troupe, because they describe going to a cultural event where dancers were doing a folk dance mixed with ballet, and that must have been the Rida troupe, because this is what they were trying to do at the time. But it was such a culturally, there was such a thickly contextualized period, sound-wise, and the coming in of industry, etc. And I think in that sense, the sound recording is also very significant historically. Yeah, that was my engagement with this.
Thank you so much, Alia. Well, I have a couple of questions, like very broad questions. This is not an ethnographic account. It was not meant to be anyways, and it's not a conventional travelogue either. Like the Dolds, however, wanted to preserve these letters as a record of their experience, not necessarily as a historical source for the public. And this makes the letters actually more valuable for historians because they're not intentional, like, they're not an intentional historical source. So my question for you, Laura, is when you read these letters for the first time, what made you think it was important to make this their very personal account public, to publish it, especially in the context of its inclusion of what you have called like worrisome imperial claims about the Arab world? I have to say, I really appreciate your academic integrity here. It's not easy to say something like that about one's parents. It must have been a hard decision, not just to publish the letters, but also to highlight this dimension in your introduction. And question for everyone, like in light of your respective areas of expertise, Alia just touched on that, like from her perspective. What does this book add to our understanding of American-Egyptian relations in the 1960s, issues of race and gender in both Egypt and the US, history of Cairo as a city? Does it add to confirm, challenge what we know about Egyptian politics and culture in the 1960s? In general, what is the historical value of these letters?
So if that's okay, I will respond to the first question then, Yasser. I very much appreciate that question because when I first read these letters, I didn't know what I was going to do with them. Like I said, I had no prescription, no set of expectations, but there were a lot of them, and I spent a lot of time reading. And I'm a historian by trade, so I was toggling back and forth between sometimes a very young girl as a daughter to being a professional historian and back again. And it was one of the most moving and confusing experiences of my life, I must admit. So I didn't make a decision right away because I guess the one thing that I have learned is to not make fast decisions when you're when you're given a load of material, that the material will tell you what it needs if you listen carefully enough and are careful enough. So I gave it the time that it needed to decant, as a colleague of mine likes to say. And I became increasingly fascinated with the things that weren't said. In other words, when there were turns of phrase that sounded strange to me, or that I knew that maybe were intentionally or not, had made it past censors, but that were telling me something, then I would go down the rabbit hole for another week trying to read about what could that possibly be. And it turned out that I described in the foreword of this book as being these letters being holographic in quality. And when you just bothered to scratch the surface, these stories would just explode out of these letters. And so I thought to myself, I wonder if there's a way to use these letters as kind of meaningful portals, and to offer them up in a way where it wasn't highly mediated, because I wasn't in a position to mediate them, or I didn't want to. I wanted to offer them up in the clearest possible way, contextualized way, so that people like, all of you could, in a way, could make sense of them, could make further sense of them. So it taught me, like I said, it taught me a lot about thinking about the past. And more importantly, it taught me about what happens when you're thinking about the past at such a subject that is so really close to the bone. What do you do with that information? And the audio tape, Alia's, your response, I have a laundry list of things to respond, but I won't take up too much time. But Alia, your response, for example, the section of the tape where the students are, that is from a engineering standpoint, that is the most illegible. From a linguistic standpoint, the most illegible in the entire 3-hour tape. And I was really in despair about that one little piece, because I thought I don't even know whether to include it. I mean, the person who was transcribing it had a very difficult time making out what was being said. So the fact that that was one of the most moving parts of that tape is such a lesson to me already, right? Anyway, I will let the rest of you respond.
Thank you.
I read this in large measure as a story about American innocence. Especially in this period, 50s, 60s, when Americans traveled abroad, generally speaking, people thought, we do good. And so, in fact, adults come to Egypt to do things which they imagine are going to be good and even beneficial for Egypt. And within just a few months, Franz finds out that no, he's not going to be allowed to do this at all. And he understands it in terms of Egyptian bureaucracy and processes and procedures that are very opaque to him. He doesn't talk about the CIA's collaboration in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, which was a huge thing in Egypt. It doesn't talk about the fact that the United States is beginning to escalate troops in Vietnam. It doesn't talk about the fact that the diplomatic pouch passes through the office of the president of the American University Cairo, who's functioning essentially as a CIA asset. I mean, he doesn't know some of those things, and others of them, which he probably did know, don't make it into his consciousness. And so even though the Dalks are supremely well-intentioned, I mean, they're not, they came to do good there. They don't understand why it is that their intentions and that their very presence there is very difficult for most Egyptians to understand.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Beinin. And any other comments on the historical?
I could comment. I think it's very significant because or like part of the significance that I think is very significant is that is how it documents an everyday, whether it's through the sounds or through their daily sort of observations, etc. And people usually don't document their everyday in this detail because it's every day and it continues happening every day, and we only realize it when we move away or when decades have passed and you realize that, you know, you don't hear the sound anymore or you don't see this happening anymore. And I think because it was so new to them, they documented everything in such detail. I think where they came from and where they came from socio-economically and also physically, it's like nationality-wise, etc., really helped on all the details that will make this a significant source historically, because many of these things have disappeared and because people don't document their daily lives so diligently because it continues happening, and to them it was so new. The steel plant is gone now. There's the work of Dina Makram Abeid and Malak Labib, who's doing almost exactly what France was trying to do. She's trying to look at the efficiency of workers and how that was worked on. There are a number of things besides this whole moment of time that have disappeared. I think it might be worth considering. I mean, there are also other things like what you mentioned about the shards of pottery, for instance, or those moments where there were those archaeological the things left behind. If you have pictures of those things, I think those might be worth putting, because they describe them also in so much detail, and the reliefs in Luqsor, those could go into the book, I think.
I just to respond to that as well, you know, I appreciate that you were bringing up the SRC, that, you know, there could potentially be some other resources there as well. There is a mention in one of the letters about a particular reporter. Yeah. I don't know, there were, as I understand it, 2 major newspapers at the time, but in Cairo, but a reporter who kind of got wind of what my father was trying to research and wrote a rather detailed and scathing article about it. And I do still kind of feel like that might have been the smoking gun in terms of understanding, you know, it would have been really helpful to get my hands on that. And I tried. I couldn't. I tried very, very hard to dig it up, but that didn't work out. So those kinds of leads are, you know, certainly very helpful. And to answer the question about awareness, you know, and I've said this as well, is that I think it was a combination of things in terms of what the letters don't say, in terms of wanting it to be safe enough, in other words, to make it through the mail, to just basically for it to fulfill its function, which is to, you know, cross the water, but also just there being a lack of information as well. I mean, I think there just was a general lack. So those are the two. It was kind of a double-edged sword at that point.
Okay, do you have time for more questions from me, or should we open it up for the audience if they have any questions? Okay, I don't see questions in the questions box, but I have one more questions about the issue of ethnocentrism. I mean, in these letters, or Orientalism. This is for me a primary source, so I don't think we are here to critique the authors, but probably reflect on the culture and historical context that produced this mood of thinking. Was it actually easy to overcome this like hegemonic discourse? With that being said, I'm still perplexed, like, to see a young, very educated couple thinking similarly to travelers who visited Cairo probably like in the early 1800s. Was constantly reminded of Timothy Mitchell and Edward Said as I read, like, you know, some of these letters. There's no specific question here, but I'd like hear your thoughts on this issue, because it bothered me a little, like as I read through these letters, and probably like we can also talk about like Kulthum for a little bit, because I personally have failed miserably to convince any American that her voice was actually good and that she is a legend. She's like her music is extremely difficult to digest for the uninitiated, I would say, and described in these letters, like it's a quotation that like her voice sounds like the siren calls of a lovesick cat at midnight. This is how it sounds, how she sounded like for like Westerners. But yeah. Okay, I think we have one question from the audience. I'll just add it here. Okay, how the author's mother kept her own letters that she sent while did not have the letters she received. Okay, this is a question like from Hanan Hamad. Thank you, Hanan.
Thank you, Hannah, for the question. I wish I had some elaborate explanation for you, but I don't. It's just one of those, you know, the function of a family moving several times in between. I think that it's kind of miraculous that they exist at all, the letters that we do have, but I don't know what happened to those others. I just know that there was a lot of intention for them for Franz and Roberta, rather, that their letters be saved. They were, like Yasser had mentioned before, they were really, really set on that. So they, you know, they said it several times to their parents. They would have had to be willfully disobeying them to not put them in a safe shoebox. But I don't know why the responses aren't there. I have no idea.
I want to say something about Americans and Kulthum. So actually, this is a great moment for Kulthum, because Inta Omri, probably her best known song, was released at this point, and it's a collaboration between her and Muhammad Abdul Wahab. So two of the three legendary greats of 20th century Egyptian popular music are embodied in the song. Time magazine should have been ashamed of itself to write something like that, because they could have gone to some Egyptian, or in fact any Arab, because she was and remains known throughout the Arab world. So what's going on here? Why do people like this? What is special about this? So I acknowledge, for someone who grew up with a Western musical education, it wasn't until I lived with three Egyptians sharing an apartment, and I sat down with them and I said, okay, you're going to teach me how to appreciate this music. What do I have to do? What do I need to listen to? How does it work? So I made it a point to do it. I mean, no, a casual American, probably you wouldn't, but it's certainly accessible. You can learn. But the fact that Time magazine didn't think it was necessary to learn, I think, is an expression of the Western sense that, okay, there was Egypt of the monarchy, which was very open to foreigners, in which foreigners had a privileged position. People mentioned that already. And then Westerners didn't know what to make of Nasser, because he wanted to change all that. And the extent to which he did or didn't succeed, we could have big debate about that. But the idea that Nasser and many, many Egyptians, because he was, after all, quite popular despite being an authoritarian, thought, no, we don't want to do things that way. We want to do things our way. And yeah, most Westerners, well, why would you want to do that? And the answer, because we're Egyptians, and this is our culture, and we want our country to be run the way we think it should be run. That was just something that most Westerners couldn't understand.
Annalise, you're trying to say something, or I don't know. Like, I think you're on mute.
There it goes. So sorry. I was just going to maybe just add just briefly that, yeah, I think that there is maybe the part of what this does do is captures a bit of a Cold War story, where some of those older Orientalist kind of impulses can, like, they get drawn on because they fit into a Cold War American sort of view of the world that fits with Vietnam, that fits with events elsewhere in Africa, you know, that sort of sits into that in some really unfortunate ways, and unfortunate being an understatement, but I think that this is a Cold War story, and that's one of, I feel like, for me, that period in the 50s and 60s, Egyptian history tells a very important Cold War story that I think to this day, Americans and even historians of the United States kind of tend to overlook how significant this sort of back and forth of American foreign policy, the inconsistencies of American views of these proxy places, you know, that like these are actual people who live there who are deeply affected by those policies, and to be sort of seen as a proxy is then deeply sort of, well, degrading. And I think that then that neo-Orientalism, if you will, kind of fits right. It's easy, and dominant then, and this captures some of that.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I think we have one more question. It's for you, Laura. Did your parents form any long-lasting bonds and friendships with any Egyptians during their stay in Cairo?
So that's a great question, and so I would say conventionally no, in the sense that no, there was no one with a name and a face and address, a real person, in the sense that it was, you know, human contact that carried over. However, I have to qualify that by saying that, ironically enough, and I guess this enters some kind of dream world, but there was always a presence of Cairo and the people that they did make their friendships with in the house that I grew up in. And it was, I think, in many ways, I don't want to speak for her necessarily, but I think it was one of the most important experiences of Roberta's life, because it has absolutely shaped who she is. It shapes her physical environment from the time she came back. So you know, the household that I grew up in was full of Egyptian things. Like there were, it was just full of Egyptian things. And I thought that was normal for an American kid. So it's not an easy answer to that question, in the sense that there was presence. And I think part of the reason that this project has been so rewarding is to try to figure out what that actually means. Like, how do we live in, you know, to what part, how do we extract that, and how do we make meaning out of it? And the slippage that you've all talked about, you know, those kinds of myth making is absolutely a part of it. And I think that's part of what is valuable about making, you know, creating a book like this, making it, and then kind of setting it out and creating some separation and having a conversation like this, because it creates some context for it that involved real people on both sides. So thank you. I'd like to say just thank you very, very much. I have so much respect for all of your work, and it's been a really rewarding experience to be part of this conversation. So
okay, I think we're like out of time already. So I would like to thank everyone, the audience, our speakers, the organizers, and everyone. I'll pivot over to Abby for some final remarks.
Thank you so much to each and every one of you. This was like such a luminous, scintillating discussion, and I'm so grateful for you all today, lending your morning, your evening, whatever time of day to share some of your ideas. So I'm going to put some information into the chat for our audience. I'll do that right now. So for those of you interested in buying the book, I've sent the link to do so. We also have a discount code specifically for attendees of the discussion today. If your library or affiliated institution is interested in purchasing the text, please tell them to reach out to us here at Send & Press. Looking forward, Send & Press is a really exciting and very busy next couple of months. So to stay up to date with our event schedule, please sign up for our mailing list, follow us on social media, info about that also in the chat. We have an anthology of illustrated bilingual poetry that is forthcoming in 2022. So keep an eye out because information around that will be also trickling in. Thank you so much again to our panelists, to everyone who attended today, and wherever you are in the world, have a great rest of your day.